Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for this opportunity to speak here in Boston today. It's really great to do this Warburg tour. It's a bit stressing sometimes if I forget for a moment at which airport I'm currently at, but it is really great because it is also an opportunity to meet people outside of Washington and to go into the regional chapters. So I think it's really an asset of ACG to have these regional chapters. So thank you very much again for the invitation. What I would like to do today in the next 40 minutes or so is to present to you or to discuss with you some of the major conclusions of a project that I had the chance to participate in while working for the German Foreign Office until the beginning of this year. I did work for the policy planning unit, which is something like an internal think tank of the Foreign Office, and this project was also done in collaboration with the USA desk in the office. And this project was called, or is called, Strategy Room on the Transatlantic Agenda 2016 to 2018. And this Strategy Room is it's a format that is part of a much larger endeavor that the German Foreign Office has undertaken since last year to overhaul some of its structures, to enhance strategic thinking in the German Foreign Office, also to bring the people who are usually very preoccupied with day-to-day crisis management and give them the opportunity to think more strategically about issues such as the transatlantic relationship. So I had a chance to participate in this project, and since we mostly had very internal conversations in the German Foreign Office, it was mostly officials talking with each other and discussing with each other. I think it is a very good opportunity to take these conclusions and also present them to a broader audience of civil society in the United States, and this is exactly what I would like to do. So, that being said, let me give you a quick overview of the structure of my presentation. So I hope this will work. Yeah, here we go. So basically, I would like to do to work through six major points in my presentation. The first is, and that's really what you have to do when you do a strategic exercise, you have to identify the major problems. So we were discussing a lot what the major problem was in our transatlantic relationship. And then the other important task when you want to do strategy is to identify priorities. So we set out this endeavor, this project, with at least a dozen different topics that all potentially have importance or have potential importance for the transatlantic relationship. But our task was really to boil it down to no more than 4 priorities. And so our task was to drop some of these, and we finally ended up discussing these 4 priorities that come next. That is Russia and European security, turmoil in the Middle East, specifically Syria, transatlantic dialogue on so-called key powers, specifically China and Turkey, TTIP, so the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, was our 4th priority, partly linked also to cyber issues and the digital agenda. And finally, so I will share with you our major conclusion for each of these priorities. And finally, I will also, because this was a government exercise, we also were tasked, of course, to give some policy recommendations to our Foreign Minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, and the leadership of the Foreign Office. And I would like to share some of these recommendations that we made. That being said, it is important to note that now that I switched back into the research community, I don't present like official government policy here. It's really just to share some of the thoughts and processes that we had. And I think because the agenda is so broad that there will be a lot of scope to discuss any individual issues that you would like to discuss with me. Okay, so let me start with the first major point. What really is the difficulty? What's really the state of affairs of the transatlantic relationship? What's the problem? And we did in this group really a very basic brainstorming process. So we were asking there were about 20 government officials involved in this exercise. And so we were really asking the participants of the strategy room, what do you see as the major drivers of transatlantic relations, and what do you see as the major obstacles to transatlantic relations? And I don't want to discuss in any detail, every individual factor that you can see on the slide. It's just to give you an idea about any of the factors that came up during this discussion. But what's important is then when we did this exercise and we looked at the pattern that occurred, it was a little bit along these lines. So the participants of this room identified the drivers of the transatlantic relationship, mostly in the area of international relations and government relationships, whereas the obstacles of the transatlantic relationship were seen by the participants mostly in the area of society and on the national domestic level of each side in the Atlantic. So in other words, we identified what we call the Transatlantic Paradox. And if you take standard language of any dictionary, a paradox usually is defined as a situation that seems to be impossible because it is set up of two opposite things. And we thought that transatlantic relations can be characterized as a paradox because it is on the governmental to government level as close and as good as it hasn't been for a very long time. So relationship between Berlin and Washington on the government to government level is very close. You can see it when you look at the current crisis of the day, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Syria, whether it's Northern Africa, and also TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. So there is a very close collaboration. But the problem is that this close cooperation seems to be driven very much by crisis and also by personal relationships. For instance, the fact that Obama and Chancellor Merkel get along very well, that Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier and also Secretary of State John Kerry get along very well. But the question is there also sufficiently a long-term basis for the transatlantic relationship? And this brings me to the second part of this paradox, namely that we identified as a major problem that the societal and the domestic basis of transatlantic relations might be fraying or might be eroding. We identified this as a very general challenge, as a very important challenge to the transatlantic relationship. On both sides of the Atlantic, but maybe for different reasons. In Germany, public opinion is a major problem. Historically, the approval or the esteem of the United States in German public opinion has been very high, but partly because of the Snowden revelations, but also because of longer-term factors, it has been decreasing. If you take, for instance, one very current, recent poll conducted by the German Marshall Fund, you will see that over the last 3 years, the percentage of Germans who have a very positive view of the United States dropped from 73% to 58%. So of course, public opinion polls are always very tricky, but this is an indicator that there might be a problem in German society. But then when you look at the other side of the Atlantic, when you look into the United States, but also in many other European countries, another problem that occurs is the rise of populism, obviously. And when we discussed the issue of populism, our major assumption was that the phenomenon of Trump, for instance, here in the United States, isn't just a unique development in America, but rather there is a risk that Trumpism is part of a larger surge of populism in Western societies. And again, if you look on the European side of the Atlantic, you will find out that in recent months or in the last 2-3 years, populist parties have gained quite significantly in regional or national elections, including also in Germany very recently. Germany didn't really have a populist party since World War II, I would say, but now with the Alternative für Deutschland, we have a very strong right-wing populist party that, just like Donald Trump, doesn't really have a very clear foreign policy agenda, but it does have a certain anti-Americanist take on its foreign policy platform. So, and also if you take the broader European picture, you will see that populist parties participate now in at least 6 EU member states in the government, or in the case of Poland, they are even running the government. So this is really something, and all of these movements, however much or however strong their difference is among each other, all of them share some characteristics that very much run against what I would call the liberal internationalist consensus that has underpinned transatlantic relationship for decades. So if these populist movements gain significance on both sides of the Atlantic, it will not be for the benefit of the transatlantic relationship. So this is what I would call the transatlantic paradox. I just wanted to, this is just a definition of what populism means, but I took this very interesting headline, "Little Trumps are in every European country." I took it from the Atlantic Journal of March, the issue of March 3rd, 2016. It's just an indication of this quite, I guess, common view right now that we are facing a more general problem in the Atlantic sphere. So this brings me to the specific 4 priority areas that we identified in this strategy room, in this particular project in the German Foreign Office. I just want to say a brief words about prioritization, because as I said, we were tasked to pick no more than 4 issue areas out of at least a dozen that we identified at the beginning, and we had quite interesting debates about which topics should be included and should not be included in a transatlantic agenda, at least from a German perspective. And the one, or maybe I will just summarize 3 criteria that we used for picking these priorities. The first is really what's the relevance of any given topic for German foreign and security policy. And because this was done on behalf of the German Foreign Office, the question is also what's the relevance of the German Foreign Office in running this particular topic or in dealing with this particular topic. The second criteria is what's the relevance of our partnership with the United States. For instance, when I talked to other audiences, I was quite often asked, why didn't you include the European Union or the risk that the European Union breaks apart? Why didn't you include this into your shortlist? And the answer would be, it is a very high priority for Germany and German foreign policy, but it's not necessarily part of our transatlantic agenda, whether this is justified or not. But this is the second criteria. And the third criteria is, or has been, what are issue areas where Germany really has something to offer, where Germany has assets to offer also to the United States, be it in terms of legitimacy, in terms of diplomatic assets, in terms of financial assets maybe. So taking these 3 criteria, we ended up with these 4 priorities that I mentioned: European security, Middle East, transatlantic dialogue on key partners, and finally TTIP. So let me say a few words on each of these topics. The first one, Russia and European security. This is of great concern, of course, or has always been of great concern to German foreign policy. But this year, specifically 2016, is a crucial year because we will have, first off, we will have an important NATO summit in July in Warsaw. And at the same time, Germany took over the chairmanship of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is basically the only remaining European institution that includes Russia and that offers channels, formal channels for dialogue with Russia. And so basically, it could be seen as a trade-off because the NATO agenda is very much driven at the moment by deterrence, talk about military deterrence, talk about reassurance, whereas the principal goal of Germany within the OSCE is to foster dialogue and promote dialogue. So do these 2 goals contradict each other, or if they don't per se contradict each other, how do we find the right balance? And that was also our assumption, that we don't have a new Cold War. So even though the relationship with Russia deteriorated considerably, this is not yet another Cold War. But there is one similarity to the Cold War, and that is that we have to find another balance, or we have again to find a balance between assurance, deterrence on the one hand side, and dialogue with Russia on the other hand side. And this time, even it might be the case that this balance, or to strike this balance, might be more difficult than at previous times. And that also there's more scope for transatlantic conflict in finding such a balance, that there is less of an overarching strategic framework in which we can look for such a balance, that the situation has even become more difficult. And to be a little bit simplistic maybe, you could argue that from a German perspective, also if you take into account the public perception in Germany, the United States at the moment is too much focused on the deterrence part. It does place too much emphasis on military issues. And I will give you two examples where you could, see this perception. One is, as you might know, the US has very recently decided to deploy another armored brigade combat team to Eastern Europe, to Central Eastern Europe. So this is not a huge amount of troops. It's maximum 5,000 troops. But still, as I see it, if I look at German media debates and also public debates, this decision has met with quite some skepticism, or has met quite some skepticism in Germany. Another issue that we could discuss about is the decision of the Obama administration to modernize its nuclear weapons, and also the nuclear weapons, the very few nuclear weapons that remain on German soil. This has also been met with quite some hostility in Germany, which has always, the population has always had a very difficult relationship with nuclear issues, I would say. So this is the risk that in Germany, there's the perception that, the Americans are too much focusing on military deterrence. And then there's another side to it as well, that on the American side, there is some potential mistrust whenever Germans, be it academics or officials, talk to their American counterparts and say, we need to also keep up dialogue channels with Russia. There's a mistrust on the American side. If you say you want to have dialogue with Russia, are you willing to trade away basic European principles that underpin European security, such as territorial integrity of each and every state, or the ability to choose your own alliances? Of course, this is not the intention of the German government, but there is some mistrust that this might, happen. So there is definitely scope for transatlantic misunderstandings when we have to deal now in the future with the European security landscape. Brings me to the second point, the Middle East and Germany's role and the transatlantic relationship in the context of the Middle East. Our assumption basically was that the United States has a lot of troubles at the moment, in the sense that its traditional alliances in the Middle East are fraying as well, or are at least becoming more complicated. So the US relationship with its traditional allies, such as Turkey or Israel and the Arab Gulf monarchies, specifically, of course, Saudi Arabia, has become more difficult for several reasons. And because this is so, a traditional German foreign policy strength, namely to open up negotiations among actors that don't like each other too much, the way to promote new negotiation formats. That could be a specific asset that would also make Germany a more important partner for the United States. And the Syria negotiations, the negotiations over how to hopefully end the civil war in Syria, is a good case in point, where, for instance, the German government has pressed very hard to bring in Iran or Russia, which for the United States, for domestic political reasons, seems to be very hard. So this is basically another conclusion, that Germany might play a more visible role in the Middle East in the future, but the question is also what will happen if the military instruments become more relevant again. I mean, Germany took quite significant steps which were costly also in a domestic German context, to arm the Kurdish Peshmerga or to participate in the air campaign, at least in a more passive role and logistical role to participate in the air campaign against the Islamic State. But if the Syria peace process unravels, which it hopefully won't, but if it doesn't lead to immediate results, and if there is a request for additional military assets, will this be, how will Germany react then? That's a very open question. And so to rush further into our third priority, transatlantic dialogue on key countries. So here the basic idea is that both the United States and Germany are facing relationships with countries, and we emphasized in our group China and Turkey, that are both crucial for both countries, but also increasingly difficult partners. And the basic idea is that if the United States and Germany can coordinate better, or at least have a more structured dialogue on how to deal with these key third countries, it would definitely be for the benefit of the transatlantic relationship. And there is definitely a lack of appropriate channels at the moment to discuss some of these issues. And I would like to give you an example with regard to China. So you might have heard about this new Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. So it's a very recent Chinese initiative to build a new institution, a new Asian Development Bank, which has not been supported, to say the very least, by Washington, because the United States administration sees this bank as a rival to those international institutions, specifically the International Monetary Fund, that it leads itself. And at some point there was the expectation of Washington that its European allies, including Germany, would follow this lead, would follow Washington lead and not support this new initiative, this new Chinese-led initiative. But this is not what happened. In fact, at least I think 14 EU member states supported this AIIB, and Germany is the fourth largest shareholder, I think with roughly 4% of the shares of the AIIB. And this situation also led to transatlantic conflict. And maybe if we had a better and more structured dialogue with the United States on how to deal with China in the future, we could prevent at least this kind of misunderstandings. And of course, as I mentioned, Turkey is another country. As the Turkish government takes on an increasingly more authoritarian turn, and as Turkey at the same time has become much more crucial for German foreign policy, of course, also against the backdrop of the immigration crisis, because Turkey is the major transit country for Syrian refugees, and Turkey has become more important also for the United States, at least because of the fight against the Islamic State. So again, how can we maybe cooperate better across the Atlantic in dealing with a country such as Turkey? And that brings me to the fourth and final major topic that we discussed or that we covered. That is TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and also linked to it, even though formally in negotiations these are two separate issues, but also linked a little bit to the digital agenda. Because, as you will immediately see, trade and investment issues and also digital issues, digital economy, aren't really core competencies of the Foreign Office or the foreign policy establishment per se. They are rather economic issues, but we decided to include them in our short list, in our project, because TTIP is much more, and also digital issues are much more than just economic issues. They are core transatlantic projects, and if they fail, if they create more conflict, they will also have negative repercussions for the transatlantic relationship in general, so going far beyond economics. And the problem with both TTIP and the digital agenda, privacy data, also privacy data protection, the common denominator of these two topics is that they are really societal stumbling blocks, at least on the German side. They are very crucial, but unlike Russia or China or the Middle East, they really reach into German society. These are topics that Germans in general, even outside the foreign policy establishment, very much care about. And to date, the overall perception is rather negative overall. At least there is domestic opposition to it. And I think there are two major reasons why there is opposition in German society, both against TTIP and against the digital agenda. One is that there is a significant power asymmetry across the Atlantic, which I think Germans still have trouble to deal with. So if you take digital agenda, about 90% of the bits and bytes that flow across the Atlantic, 90% of the data that crosses the Atlantic is controlled by US-based companies. And since US-based companies are subject to US law, there is a certain privileged access of US government and law enforcement agencies to this data, private data. And this has been identified as a problem for a long time, and there are negotiations going on how to find an adequate substitute to the safe harbor agreement and to find legal grounds to deal with this. But this, I think, power asymmetry is one reason why there is a certain skepticism towards this, and also this reaches into TTIP. Whether this is a rational argument or not, those who oppose TTIP also, at least a fraction of them, argue that TTIP would only benefit not only big companies but specifically big American companies, and that we might in the end have to adapt some regulations or some practices that are common in the United States, and that we have to do it also in Europe. And the chlorine chicken is just one example of it. I'm not saying that these are rational arguments, but it is definitely out there. And the other, apart from this asymmetry in power, the other reason why TTIP and the digital agenda are meeting some hostility in German society is that there are, in fact, different philosophies across the Atlantic. For instance, when we talk about consumer protection. So in Germany and in Europe writ large, I would argue, and this is also what we identified in this group, there's a dominant approach that we call prevention approach or preventive approach. So in Europe, and generally, there is more focus on a strong state and strong state regulations so that consumers' rights are protected, for instance. Whereas in the United States, it's more of a post-the-fact or a follow-up care approach. So there is generally much less emphasis on state regulations and more emphasis on judicial and punishment mechanisms that might prevent or might deter consumers' harm in the first place. But these are different approaches, and they always clash also in the TTIP negotiations. And this is also a source of fear in quarters of the German society that oppose TTIP. So we have to deal with these different philosophies and different power potentials. So let me close my brief presentation by talking a little bit about the policy recommendations, and let me start with Russia and European security. Russia and European security is very much, not exclusively, but very much also a communication problem. I would like to give you an example, and this is really something I do know as a researcher, that, for instance, when, 3 months ago, there was a broadcast in German public TV about this nuclear modernization that I mentioned. So the decision of the Americans to modernize nuclear weapons. And this was taken up in German TV as a decision that the Americans want to add new nuclear weapons to Germany and Europe, which is false. But unfortunately, there was no one really in the German government or in the German academia circles as well that opposed this narrative. If you took this particular broadcast, for instance, There was a former retired German general who spoke, and there was the spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry commenting on this. You can imagine that this was not a very balanced comment. So it would be crucial in the future that there will also be either government officials or people from the academia who offer also a counter-narrative, that this is not about adding new nuclear weapons, but rather modernizing and making more secure existing ones. And this is just a brief, anecdotal example where I would say, that epitomizes, to me at least, the need to enhance communication and also communication towards the United States, of course, that we're not willing to negotiate away basic principles when we deal with Russia. So communication is a very key point. On the Middle East, the second issue, I would simply say that it will be because if the assumption is that Germany will play a more important role in the Middle East as well, we will have to think about what this means in practice. And of course, there are different scenarios. So if the civil war in Syria continues unabated, we will probably have to take on more refugees in Europe. We will have to enhance our humanitarian aid, and this really brings back the question of how you do this on a European level rather than on an individual national level. But then, as I mentioned briefly, it might also mean that we will have new debates about additional military contributions. The United States is pressing its European allies already to enhance its contributions to fighting the Islamic State. But even in the more positive scenario of Syrian civil war coming to an end at some point, there will be a need for post-conflict stabilization that might also have an international military component. And again, this will also put new demands, potential demands, on the German government. Let me maybe close with two final recommendations that we identified. When we talk about transatlantic dialogue on key partners, I mentioned very briefly at the beginning that there is a certain lack of appropriate channels across the Atlantic to deal with China or Turkey. And one promising avenue could be that we involve Congress more deeply, and also Congress to German Parliament more deeply. For instance, there is quite a number of influential Congress people that have a strong link to Germany and German society. And at least I found out when I was in Washington to present our results of the strategy room, I found out that quite often these people and also the groups that involve these Congress people don't necessarily talk about third countries or don't talk sufficiently about China or about Turkey. So we could enhance this. And the other problem is that whenever there is already a transatlantic dialogue, for instance, think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, they on an annual basis have a transatlantic dialogue on China, but unfortunately it's always the European people that talk to each other on China. But it should be better if also the respective Asian people would talk to each other. So the Asian desks in the foreign offices and the foreign ministries, or the Asian experts on both sides of the Atlantic should talk about China, not only the people that usually cover European issues. So the final recommendation I would like to mention relates to the digital agenda. And this is a more general problem, I guess, in transatlantic relations. In Germany, usually there is a tendency to consider the United States almost like, a monolith, almost like a rock. We underappreciate in Germany the fact that there are fierce debates also inside the United States about foreign policy. And also, of course, there are fierce debates inside the United States about the proper balancing of privacy protection versus security interests. And maybe we should acknowledge this diversity of the debate in the US and also talk to actors that maybe share some of the German concerns or European concerns with regard to privacy protection. And I just mentioned here on the slide the very current fight between Apple and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which shows that this debate is taking place also inside the United States, and maybe that working more closely with US-based companies on enhancing privacy protection, private data protection, could be a better way than to consider them really as opponents or as part of the problem. So I will leave it there. I think I've talked enough right now, and I'm very happy to have a hopefully lively discussion and to take your questions. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and we can ask them. Yes, sir.
Is there a person in Germany like Donald Trump who can be identified?
Like a charismatic leader who, I would say at the moment not yet, no, because the Alternative für Deutschland, the populist party that we have in Germany at the moment, doesn't really have very charismatic leaders at the moment.
What did you say the name of that party is?
Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, AfD, which is, it's a relatively recent party. Originally, they were created, I think, 3 years ago as a party that opposes the common currency, the euro, in Germany, from Germany. It's very EU skeptical in that sense, but it has changed and evolved recently and become more nationalistic.
Question? Yes.
I'm interested in this balance between dialogue and deterrence, and specifically what the state of play may be now in dialogue on Germany's part, or Merkel's part with Putin, and whatever you might know about the aims and focus of that dialogue, since Putin is not such a dialoguing kind of guy.
Well, there is, I mean, most of this is really in the early development stages, if you will. There are institutions that were in place already, so it's not really about inventing new formats or new structures. Very recently, I mean, there's this NATO-Russia Council, so a council that was created in between NATO and Russia in the 1990s to have a more open and structured dialogue with Russia on security issues. And this was basically frozen more or less after the Ukraine invasion, the Ukraine annexation, the annexation of Crimea, I'm sorry. And now a very small step was taken to revitalize this particular body within NATO, and Germany pushed very hard for it, for this to happen. But there's a lot of small, sometimes formal and sometimes informal channels within the OSCE, so the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, dealing about sometimes very concrete, specific issues such as avoiding military incidents, building confidence measures. There's larger, more strategically important questions that are not addressed yet, such as conventional arms treaty, which is dormant, has been dormant even before the Ukraine crisis. So there's a lot of, I think the focus is really very much on pragmatism at the moment. Build really small channels, or revitalize smaller channels to talk to Russia at some point. And then, of course, the whole process of implementing the peace agreement or the peace process in Ukraine, the so-called Minsk process, which is having a lot of troubles at the moment. It's also requiring constant dialogue at some point with Russia over very specific questions. So, I mean, the motto of the German chairmanship of the OSCE is, renewing dialogue and rebuilding trust and enhancing security. I think that's the official dialogue, and that is done in very pragmatic, down-to-earth ways at the moment. There's no one really, I think, in Germany that hopes that we will have a a huge relaunch of European security order anytime soon. Exactly because no one is willing to negotiate away, these principles.
I know this is off subject, but one of my guests asked me to ask this. He couldn't come.
Okay.
Can you talk about Syrian refugees and how Germany will handle this massive infusion of people over the next few years?
I mean, it is definitely part of the agenda, because when I said that Germany is playing a more active role in the Middle East, this is a long-term development, dates back basically to the beginning of the 2000s, but it has been accelerated, Germany's involvement in the Middle East, of course, very much by the current refugee crisis, so it has important foreign policy repercussions as well. And I mean, dealing with it, this is something we didn't discuss because it wasn't part of the agenda, that's true, but dealing with it it's very difficult. I mean, I think that there is now a certain certain shift now taking place in Germany. So this original statement of the Chancellor to open up, to welcome the refugees and to create an open culture for refugees is increasingly under fire, and there is it's becoming more coercive and more restrictive right now. And the latest term, as I guess your Mr. What was his name? Goethe from the site also, I guess, mentioned that the crucial step that was taken very recently is to have an agreement with Turkey, between the European Union and Turkey. So basically that Turkey would take away most of the immigrants or the refugees that come over into Greece, and those who do not want to apply for asylum in Greece are turned back into Turkey, and as a part of the deal, Germany would, or not only Germany, but the EU would take the same number of Syrian refugees as basis of a resettlement program. So that's really very much the deal, or the major attempt right now to deal with this influx. But it also points to a dilemma. I mentioned Turkey in my presentation. So at the same time as Erdogan, the Turkish president, is crashing down on Turks and is curtailing media freedom, it raises a lot of discussions in Germany, but at the same time we urgently need Turkey to deal with the immigration crisis. And this causes a lot of dilemmas for the German government at the moment.
Sir, what is the policy of Germany that after there is peace in Syria, those refugees would be sent back to Syria? No, at some point there will be peace in Syria, right? Maybe after 2 years.
Yes, hopefully.
So what's the policy? Are these all the refugees will they be settled there, or will they be sent back to Syria?
First off, I'm not really an expert on the current immigration discussion in Germany, but I don't think that there is a long-term plan right now. It's really very much focused on the current situation, and once conditions will be in place for Syrian refugees to return to their country, I guess then policies will be made up. Then there will be plans, and then there will be programs. But at the moment, I think it's not on the horizon. So the focus is really very much on how do you receive these people. You need to give them some sort of occupation and schools and basic services and everything. This is really, I think, where the focus is at the moment. And I mean, historically, if you look at previous waves of refugees, for instance, after the Balkan Wars, in the course of the Balkan Wars, what happened then, once the Balkan Wars were over, part of the refugees stayed in Germany and were integrated and had a long-term perspective, and part of them returned. So it will be very similar, I think. But there are no plans at the moment. I think that's really very much
Gentlemen back there.
Germany prepared many years ago for the Syrian crisis by accepting 6 million Turkish Gastarbeiters, most of whom have gone home to Turkey. But that was a very open, warm, interesting event for those of us in the United States who saw that. And we congratulate Germany for taking a much
think these are two very, in many ways, very different situations. The Gastarbeiter program in the 60s were driven very much by labor immigration. So there was an urgent need in the German economy to have these workers, and they were welcomed partly because of this. They were not war refugees. And today the situation is different. But interestingly, in my perspective, the German industry associations take a very forthcoming approach to the Syrian refugees. I mean, they are broadcasting advertisements on TV and saying that basically we need to integrate them. There's the hope that they can be integrated into the German labor market. There is a need for having qualified workers, but not all of the Syrian refugees are qualified. I mean, most of them don't speak German, and not all of them are engineers. So it's not the same situation. It's much more difficult, and they are traumatized. People become traumatized by the war. The Turkish Gastarbeiter were not. And by the way, a lot of Turks remained. The fact that Berlin has the largest Turkish community, I think, outside of Turkey is really reason. I mean, it goes back to this time. So if you go to Berlin, we have a lot of Turkish communities there.
Let's take a couple of questions. Peter, yes?
I have two questions. May I ask two?
Yes, okay.
My first question, regarding the national foundations of foreign policy. The United States very often determines its foreign policy based on the makeup of the U.S. population. The Irish Americans, the Italian Americans, they constitute an important voting bloc and are treated as such. The United States takes care of it. Now, how about German Americans? Do they constitute a voting bloc? Does the United States, in its foreign policy, bases its decisions on that fact? Because there are probably many more of them than Italian Americans or Irish Americans. That's one question.
I'm not sure if I got it. So if there is in Germany a voting bloc of
in America.
Okay, the German community
yes.
in the United States. Okay.
Yes. And if I may ask the second question, the possible breakup of the liberal internationalist consensus.
Mm-hmm.
Can we imagine transatlantic relations in the absence of a liberal consensus and reconceptualize it with an illiberal consensus, with populists being in power or influencing power on both sides of that? It might look differently, but it might be feasible.
I think this is really a really good and interesting question. I just don't know if I have the right answer for you. But to answer your first question, this is something you might tell me more than I'm able to tell, whether there is. I mean, I think there's about 20% of Americans have German roots at some point. That's the figure. I don't know if you have another one, but that's what I heard that someone from the German Marshall Fund told me very recently. So 20% of Americans have German roots. And interestingly, I mean, I talked about this. I said it deliberately when I talked about the domestic challenges of transatlantic relations. I said there are important differences, and the whole problem of public opinion is more a problem in Germany than it is in the United States. I mean, I don't think that there might be some more general disinterest in Germany. I mean, I don't know if in Germany it's really a huge. I mean. It's incredible how closely the German media follows the U.S. campaign, the U.S. electoral campaign, which is not something which goes into the other direction. But I think among the interested public there is a very positive view of Germany. That's what. But my impression is, and what people tell me in the United States. But if this is like whether this constitutes like a forceful bloc that can translate its sympathy towards Germany into political influence, I don't know. I talked about the German-American caucus in Congress, or the study group on Germany, the congressional study group on Germany, so influential Congress people with a good relation to Germany. And I think they are influential, but I don't know if that translates into, how the U.S. government runs its relations with Germany. I just don't know.
Just as an aside, some of you were here when we had a speaker about a month ago, Eric Kirschbaum, talking about the German immigration and impact on the United States, and basically how that impact has dissipated over the last century, especially since World War I. So I don't know if there is a German-American bloc anymore like there was, 80, 90 years ago. Okay, so we have two questions.
The second question.
Yeah.
May I just quickly
I'm sorry. Yes,
the second question, because I think it's a very important question about do we need to, redesign the liberal international consensus, or does it have a new foundation, or shall we change it? Well, of course, I don't think that there is an illiberal alternative to this consensus. I mean, there's no way that liberalism or the rejection of liberal thinking will offer a new foundation for the transatlantic relationships. I don't think it. I mean, if you take, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban talked about liberal democracy and the merits of illiberal democracy. I think he mostly meant economic affairs, not political affairs. But if you take this thinking, it's not helpful for transatlantic relations. But we still might want to think about, is there a new consensus? And for instance, in the past, the transatlantic relationship, the Atlanticism, the thinking behind it, was very much driven by globalization and globalization ideals. So free markets, free trade, also taking into account monetary interests. And these were the people also in the United States who were driving this transatlantic relationship. And now with Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump and the strong showing of anti-establishment candidates in the election campaign, maybe this is like a warning shot. Maybe we should build a transatlantic consensus that has a different face, is maybe a bit more skeptical towards free trade, or tries to, have a different, or be more, accord a larger political role in shaping globalization and also addressing the downsides of globalization more strongly in the transatlantic context. So my answer would be, I don't think there is an illiberal alternative to this consensus, but there might be still a need to write a new consensus that is less, at least economically liberal, or less globalization oriented as it is right now.
And we'll have two last questions. Gentleman back here and you. You want to start?
Yes. This isn't exactly transatlantic, but I know you'll know a lot about this. This is about the future of the EU. And so we have a lot of debtor nations in the EU, and then we have a lot of creditor nations, of which I guess Germany is a prime one. We also have, growing up at the same time, this nationalism around Europe and populism and so forth, and a kind of a pushback against the blending of populations and the influx of new peoples from so forth. So the question is, could you just talk a little bit about how you think the EU, how strong the EU is in terms of its future, and whether you think it is maybe weakening or breaking apart in any way? The British are
Brexit's
voting on that. And that's it.
Okay. Let's have your question also. Did you want to raise a question, sir? Oh, yes.
Yeah. My question is, you talked in the beginning a little bit about, or a lot about these personal relationships and the connections, and with Angela Merkel's ratings really dropping and concern over the 2017 campaign, and no clear front runner as the next person that could potentially succeed her, was that a concern that you were thinking about in your different areas when we were talking about Turkey and China and different areas?
So maybe I start with this question. I mean, it's I don't know what will happen in 2017, but it's relatively sure that at some point Merkel will also not be the chancellor anymore, there's also a certain appreciation that probably President Obama has been the most European-like president for a very long time in the United States. Not necessarily in the sense that he focuses so much on Europe. I mean, he promoted the whole Asia, pivot to Asia stuff. But in the way that he conducts diplomacy, his foreign policy outlook, his willingness to talk to Iran and Cuba, and also his relatively, by American standards, strong emphasis on multilateralism, all this makes him a very European president, I would say. And also in our group, in this project in the German Foreign Office, the general consensus was whoever comes next, even if it's Hillary Clinton, it will be a more difficult relationship. And what comes after Merkel, I have no idea. I mean, you're absolutely right. There is no clear, she doesn't seem to build a successor herself. And the Social Democratic Party is so weak that it's hard to think of a Social Democratic chancellor at 2017. So it's very much open in the air who will succeed her or whether she will stay in power. But it's clear that at some point there will be new figures running the transatlantic relationship. And it's very likely that it will be less close or less favorable for transatlantic relations as is the case right now. And that is the problem, because we need to build foundations for the transatlantic relationship that survive personnel constellations or specific constellations of the day, building common projects, and that is what might be missing at the moment. And the other question on Europe and European unity, I mean, of course, that is the $1 million question, I guess. I don't think that the EU will break up. It's very unlikely, and this is not the history also how European integration has been running for the last decades. So it will be, it might be like a pendulum, it might swing back right now. It's very difficult also, very complicated to, even from a formal and legal perspective, to go backwards in the European integration process, because the treaties are in place, and even if Britain wants to leave the European Union, it will be a very complex negotiation process of how this could happen. But politically, there's definitely the mood right now of nationalism rising, of being more skeptical towards supranational European Union institutions, the Commission and the Parliament. If Britain should leave the EU, or if the referendum should be affirmative in the sense that the majority promotes exit, it will be backwind for any skepticist or EU skeptical parties in the European Union. So politically, it will definitely, we will see much less attempts to bring the European integration process forward, but we will see a lot of attempts by the elites to preserve the status of European integration and to shield off further damage to it. So it will be much more status quo and much more static than it used to be in the past. But I don't see it breaking up as such.
Well, please join me in thanking our speaker for an excellent presentation.